November 12, 1944. The war in the Pacific raged with unprecedented fury, and across the American homeland, prisoner of war camps processed thousands of captured enemy soldiers. But in a small, hastily constructed facility outside Fresno, California, something extraordinary was about to unfold. When a transport truck carrying 37 Japanese women auxiliaries pulled through the gates, the American guards had no idea they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would challenge everything both sides believed about their enemies. Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The women who stepped down from that military transport were not hardened soldiers. They were young auxiliaries, ranging in age from 18 to 32, who had served the Imperial Japanese Army as radio operators, medical assistants, clerks, and communication specialists. They had been captured during the final American push through the Pacific Islands, swept up as military installations fell to overwhelming Allied force. Now they stood on American soil, trembling with fear about what awaited them. 24-year-old Harumi Nakamura clutched a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her family in Osaka. She had served as a communications operator, believing she was helping defend her homeland from American aggression. The propaganda she had been fed painted Americans as barbaric demons who showed no mercy to prisoners. As she looked around the camp with its high fences and armed guards, she steeled herself for the cruelty she had been taught to expect. Lieutenant Dorothy Callahan watched the women arrive with a mixture of professional duty and unexpected compassion. She had been assigned to oversee this unusual facility precisely because she was one of the few female officers available. The Army had no established protocols for handling female enemy prisoners. Everything about this situation was unprecedented, from the logistics of housing to the question of how to maintain security with dignity. She noticed how the Japanese women kept their eyes downcast, their bodies rigid with fear and military discipline, even in defeat. Among the prisoners, 21-year-old Michiko Fujiwara, a former medical assistant, observed the American guards with careful attention. She had been trained to recognize threats, to stay alert for any sign of danger, but what she noticed confused her. The American soldiers looked tired, some barely older than her youngest brother. They carried weapons but held them casually without the aggressive posture she had expected. One guard, a young corporal with sandy hair and a gentle face, was actually smiling as he helped an older prisoner navigate the truck's steep steps. The women were led to their barracks, a simple wooden structure that had been hastily prepared for their arrival. It was sparse but clean, with rows of narrow beds and thin mattresses. Emiko Watanabe, at 27, the eldest among the prisoners, automatically began organizing the others, assigning beds and establishing order the way she had done in her administrative role. Even in captivity, structure felt safer than chaos. As darkness fell on their first night in American hands, none of them could sleep. They lay awake, whispering fears in Japanese, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Dawn broke over the California camp with a chill that reminded Harumi of early mornings in Osaka, though nothing else about this place felt familiar. The women had barely slept, their bodies tense with anticipation of what their first full day in American captivity would bring. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a bell rang across the compound and they heard footsteps approaching their barracks. Michiko instinctively moved to the front of the group, her medical training making her protective of the younger women like 19-year-old Ayako Ishikawa, who looked terrified. Lieutenant Callahan entered with Corporal Eugene Lawson, the young guard from Nebraska who had helped the older prisoner the previous evening. Gene carried himself with an easy, unhurried manner that seemed completely at odds with the rigid military bearing the Japanese women expected. He smiled at them, though they could not understand his English words. "Morning, ladies. Time for breakfast. Follow me, please." His tone was gentle, almost apologetic for disturbing them so early. The women filed out silently, keeping close together as they walked across the compound toward a large dining hall. Through the windows, they could see long tables and the steam rising from what appeared to be a kitchen area. The smell that reached them stopped several women in their tracks. It was rich, savory, completely unlike anything they had smelled in months of military rations. Harumi felt her stomach clench with hunger she had been trying to ignore. Inside the dining hall, they found plates already set at one of the long tables, real plates, not metal mess tins. And on each plate sat something that made every woman stare in disbelief. 2 fried eggs, their yolks golden and intact. 3 thick slices of ham, still sizzling slightly from the griddle. A piece of toasted bread with butter. And beside each plate, a cup of real coffee, its aroma filling the air with an almost painful reminder of peacetime luxuries. Emiko looked at Lieutenant Callahan with confusion bordering on suspicion. This had to be some kind of trick. In Japan, even before the war, eggs and meat were precious commodities. During the war, they had become almost mythical luxuries that ordinary people rarely saw. The military rations she and the other women had subsisted on consisted of rice, pickled vegetables, and occasional fish. And now, as prisoners of war, they were being offered what looked like a feast? Corporal Lawson noticed their hesitation and mimed eating, pointing to the food and then to his mouth with an encouraging smile. "It's okay," he said slowly, though they could not understand the words. "This is breakfast, every morning, eggs and ham." He repeated the words, pointing to each item. Eggs, ham, every morning. Harumi was the first to sit down, her hunger overcoming her fear. She picked up the fork with trembling hands, looking at the eggs as if they might disappear. The other women slowly followed her lead, sitting at the table with the careful movements of people who could not quite believe what was happening. When Harumi finally tasted the eggs, tears sprang to her eyes. The breakfast routine continued every morning with the same abundance that had shocked the women on that first day. Eggs and ham served on real plates, with coffee that was hot and plentiful. For the first week, the Japanese prisoners ate in complete silence, their eyes downcast, waiting for the moment when this strange generosity would be revealed as cruelty. They had been taught that Americans were treacherous, that any kindness was merely a prelude to betrayal. But the betrayal never came. The food kept arriving, and the American guards kept smiling. Sergeant Vincent Moretti had been watching the women carefully during those first difficult days. His own parents had immigrated from Italy, and he understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, to be seen as foreign and potentially dangerous. He had grown up in a Brooklyn neighborhood where his family faced prejudice during the First World War, where being Italian meant being questioned about your loyalty. These experiences had given him a perspective that many of his fellow soldiers lacked. He saw fear in the Japanese women's eyes, not defiance. On the 8th morning, Sergeant Moretti noticed that young Ayako was coughing repeatedly, her face flushed with what appeared to be fever. She tried to hide her illness, covering her mouth and attempting to eat her breakfast despite obvious discomfort. Moretti approached Lieutenant Callahan immediately. "Ma'am, that young one in the corner looks sick. Should we get Doc Pemberton to take a look?" Callahan nodded, grateful for his attentiveness. Dr. Howard Pemberton arrived at the dining hall within minutes, carrying his medical bag with the efficient movements of a man who had treated countless soldiers on both sides of this war. He was older than most of the personnel at the camp, a widower who had volunteered for military service after losing his wife to illness 2 years earlier. When he approached Ayako, she shrank back in fear, her eyes wild with terror at the sight of an American man coming toward her. Michiko immediately stood up, positioning herself between the doctor and Ayako. Her medical training overcame her fear as protective instincts took hold. She spoke rapidly in Japanese, trying to explain to Ayako that the doctor meant no harm, though she herself was not entirely certain of this. Dr. Pemberton stopped, recognizing the fear in both women's faces. He slowly set down his medical bag and stepped back, giving them space. Then he did something unexpected. He removed his stethoscope and held it out to Michiko, gesturing for her to examine Ayako herself. Through careful pantomime, he showed her how to listen to the young woman's lungs, how to check for fever. Michiko's hands shook as she took the medical instrument, understanding that he was offering her trust, treating her not as an enemy, but as a fellow medical professional. She listened to Ayako's chest and heard the congestion immediately, her training allowing her to recognize bronchitis even without sharing a language with the American doctor. Dr. Pemberton provided medicine for Ayako's bronchitis, and within 3 days the young woman had recovered. But something more significant had been healed during those 3 days. Michiko had worked alongside the American doctor, learning his methods and sharing her own knowledge through gestures and drawings. The barrier of language remained, but the barrier of hatred had begun to crack. When Ayako returned to the dining hall for breakfast, she bowed deeply to Dr. Pemberton, a gesture of gratitude that transcended words. The doctor smiled and bowed back, his awkward attempt at her custom bringing the first genuine laughter heard in the camp since the women's arrival. The daily breakfast ritual had become something more than just a meal. It had become a language of its own, a conversation conducted through the sharing of food rather than words. Corporal Lawson began teaching the women the English names for what they ate. He would point to the eggs and say slowly, "Eggs." Then he would point to the ham, "Ham." The women would repeat the words in their accented English, stumbling over unfamiliar sounds, but trying nonetheless. Harumi discovered she had a gift for languages. She had studied some English in school before the war, though she had never imagined she would use it while sitting in an enemy prison camp. She began to volunteer as an informal translator, helping the other women understand basic instructions from the American guards. But more importantly, she began to ask questions. One morning, as Corporal Lawson refilled her coffee, she gathered her courage and spoke in halting English. "Why you give us this food? We are enemy." Jean Lawson paused, considering how to answer a question that cut to the heart of everything happening in this strange place. He sat down across from her, something that would have been unthinkable in a traditional POW camp. "Ma'am," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "my mom always said that everybody deserves breakfast. Doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. A good breakfast means you can face the day with dignity." He pointed to the eggs and ham. "This is what we eat back home in Nebraska. Seemed only right to share it." The concept was foreign to Harumi. In Japan, there were clear hierarchies, clear divisions between those who deserved comfort and those who did not. Prisoners, especially enemy prisoners, would be given the bare minimum for survival. But here was this American farm boy, talking about dignity and sharing as if they were the most natural things in the world. She translated his words for the other women, and they sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this reality with everything they had been taught. Lieutenant Callahan observed these interactions with growing hope. She had been given an impossible assignment to oversee enemy prisoners with no guidelines and no precedent, but she was beginning to see that perhaps the greatest weapon against hatred was not force, but simple, persistent kindness. Every morning, eggs and ham. Every morning, a reminder that even enemies could share a table. December brought rain to California and news from across the Pacific that shattered the fragile peace the women had found in their daily routines. The International Red Cross had finally managed to deliver letters to the camp, correspondence that had been delayed for months as it traveled through war zones and bureaucratic channels. Lieutenant Callahan called the women together in the common room, holding a stack of thin envelopes that represented the first contact many of them had received from home since their capture. Harumi's hands trembled as she accepted her letter, recognizing her mother's careful calligraphy on the envelope. She sat apart from the others, needing privacy for whatever news awaited her inside. The letter was dated 4 months earlier, written in August when American B-29s had been conducting sustained bombing campaigns over Japanese cities. Her mother's words were careful, constrained by military censorship, but the message was clear enough. Their neighborhood in Osaka had been hit. Her father and younger brother were gone. Her mother and sister had survived, but were living in a shelter with dozens of other displaced families. Across the room, Michiko read her own letter with growing horror. Her entire family had been in Hiroshima, working in factories that supported the war effort. The letter was from a cousin in a rural village, informing her that communication with Hiroshima had been cut off completely. Allied bombing had intensified to levels previously unimaginable. Her cousin could not confirm whether Michiko's parents and siblings were alive or dead, only that the city was being systematically destroyed. Emiko received no letter at all. She sat holding the empty space where hope had been, realizing that her silence was its own terrible message. Her family in Tokyo had either perished or been so displaced that they could not send word through the Red Cross channels. At 27, she might be the last survivor of her entire family line, sitting in an enemy prison camp thousands of miles from the ashes of everything she had known. Only young Ayako received news that could be called hopeful. Her family lived in a remote farming village that had so far escaped the worst of the bombing. Her parents and 3 younger siblings were struggling with food shortages, and her father had been conscripted into local defense forces, but they were alive. She wept with relief while around her, other women wept for very different reasons. That evening, the Japanese prisoners sat in the dining hall for dinner, but many could not eat despite the continued abundance of American food. The eggs and ham that had seemed like paradise now felt like a cruel reminder of the starvation their families faced back home. How could they enjoy such plenty while their loved ones struggled to find a single bowl of rice? Harumi pushed her plate away, her appetite destroyed by guilt and grief. Sergeant Moretti noticed the change immediately. The women who had finally begun to smile, to engage, to show signs of healing, had retreated back into silence and sorrow. He approached Lieutenant Callahan with concern. "Ma'am, whatever was in those letters, it wasn't good news. They look like they've lost everything." Lieutenant Callahan understood that grief required more than sympathy. It required action, purpose, and the restoration of dignity. The morning after the letters arrived, she made a decision that went against standard prisoner of war protocols. She called the women together and spoke slowly while Harumi translated, her English now confident enough to convey complex ideas. "I know many of you received difficult news from home. I know you're worried about your families. I can't change what's happening in Japan, but I can give you something here. I can give you choices." The concept seemed simple, but its implications were revolutionary. Lieutenant Callahan explained that the women could choose their work assignments within the camp. Those with medical training could assist Dr. Pemberton in the infirmary. Those with administrative skills could help with record keeping. Those who preferred physical labor could work in the kitchen or help maintain the facility grounds. For the first time since their capture, they were being asked what they wanted to do rather than simply being ordered. Michiko immediately volunteered for the infirmary. Working alongside Dr. Pemberton gave her a sense of purpose that helped quiet the terrible uncertainty about her family's fate. The American doctor welcomed her assistance with genuine appreciation, and together they developed a system of communication that combined broken English, medical terminology, and hand gestures. She discovered that healing others provided some healing for herself, that caring for sick soldiers and guards allowed her to feel useful rather than helpless. Emiko chose the administrative office, where her organizational skills quickly proved invaluable. Corporal Lawson, who had been struggling with supply records and correspondence, found in Emiko a meticulous partner who could organize chaos into order. She threw herself into the work with fierce dedication, as if creating perfect filing systems could somehow counterbalance the destruction of her homeland. The precision and control gave her something her grief could not take away. Harumi volunteered for the kitchen, a choice that surprised Lieutenant Callahan. With her language skills, she could have taken a more prominent role. But Harumi had her reasons. In the kitchen, she worked alongside American cooks, who taught her their methods, their recipes, their casual approach to food that contrasted so sharply with Japanese formality. She learned to crack eggs with one hand, to judge when ham was perfectly cooked, to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, as the head cook liked to joke. But more than that, she learned about abundance and generosity. The American cooks never hoarded food, never treated it as scarce or precious. They made extra, knowing that hungry people needed more than minimum rations. One morning, the head cook, a large man from Louisiana named Chef Robert, showed Harumi how to make scrambled eggs for 50 people. "The secret," he said, "is you cook with love. Don't matter who's eating it, enemy or friend. Good food is how you show people they matter." Spring arrived in California with wildflowers blooming across the hills, visible beyond the camp's fences. The Japanese women had now been in American captivity for 5 months, and the transformation was undeniable. They no longer walked with their eyes downcast. They laughed during meals, shared jokes in broken English with the guards, and had begun to feel something they never expected to feel in an enemy prison camp. They felt safe. They felt valued. They felt, in a way that seemed almost sinful given the circumstances, happy. Harumi wrote in a small journal that Corporal Lawson had given her, trying to process the confusion of her emotions. "We call this place paradise," she wrote in Japanese characters. "Every morning, eggs and ham. Every day, kindness where we expected cruelty. But this paradise has made everything harder, not easier. How can I return to Japan now, knowing what I know? How can I go back to a country where such abundance doesn't exist, where such kindness isn't offered freely?" The other women struggled with similar contradictions. Ayako, the youngest, had begun to dread the thought of repatriation. Her family's letters continued to arrive, each one describing worsening conditions. Food rations had been cut again. American bombing raids were intensifying. Her father had been sent to defend a coastal position that everyone knew was indefensible. Her mother's letters tried to sound brave, but Ayako could read the desperation between the lines. Going home meant returning to starvation, danger, and a war that Japan was clearly losing. Michiko faced an even more painful reality. 3 months had passed with no word from Hiroshima. Dr. Pemberton had gently suggested that she might need to prepare herself for the worst. In the infirmary, she had purpose and meaning. She was saving lives, helping people heal, using skills that made her feel valuable. What would she return to in Japan? A destroyed city, a lost family, a country that had no use for defeated soldiers, and especially no use for women who had been captured by the enemy. The paradox became clear during a conversation between Emiko and Sergeant Moretti. He had been teaching her English idioms, and she had been teaching him basic Japanese phrases. One afternoon, as they worked together on supply inventories, Emiko suddenly stopped and looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Sergeant Moretti," she said in careful English, "this camp is prison, yes? But Japan now is bigger prison. Here I have food, work, respect. There I have nothing but shame and hunger." Moretti didn't know how to respond. He understood what she meant. The women had found in captivity what many of them had never experienced, even in freedom. They had found dignity. Lieutenant Callahan had created an environment where they were treated not as enemies to be punished, but as human beings deserving of basic respect and care. The American Guards had shown them that former enemies could become friends, that national hatred could be overcome by individual kindness. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The news crackled through radios across the American camp, bringing celebrations and relief that the war in Europe had finally ended. But for the Japanese women prisoners, the news carried a different meaning. If Germany had fallen, Japan's defeat was now inevitable. It was only a matter of time before they would face the same choice their German counterparts across the country were facing: return home to a defeated nation, or somehow find a way to remain in the country that had shown them unexpected mercy. The discussions among the women became more intense, more desperate. They gathered in small groups during evening hours, speaking in hushed Japanese about possibilities that seemed impossible. Could they request to stay? Would the Americans even consider such a request? What would happen to them if they returned to Japan as defeated prisoners who had lived in comfort while their countrymen starved? The shame would be unbearable. They would be viewed as traitors, as women who had been corrupted by enemy kindness. Harumi found herself becoming the unofficial leader of those who wanted to stay. She had been writing letters to the Whitmore family, local Quakers who had visited the camp as part of a religious outreach program. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had been particularly kind to Harumi, impressed by her intelligence and her genuine remorse about the war. They had discussed literature, philosophy, and the possibility of redemption. Mrs. Whitmore had even suggested that, if circumstances allowed, Harumi might find work as a translator after the war ended. On May 20th, Lieutenant Callahan called a General Assembly to discuss repatriation procedures. The women gathered in the dining hall, the same place where they had eaten eggs and ham every morning for 6 months. The tables had been pushed aside to create an open space, but the smell of breakfast still lingered in the air, a reminder of everything this place had meant to them. Lieutenant Callahan stood before them with official documents, her expression compassionate but official. "Ladies, I have received preliminary orders regarding your eventual repatriation to Japan. The process will begin once hostilities in the Pacific conclude. You will be processed through facilities in Japan and released to return to your families and homes." She paused, seeing the mixture of resignation and fear on their faces. Harumi stood up slowly, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had practiced this moment in her mind 100 times, but now that it was here, the words felt impossible to speak. "Lieutenant Callahan," she said in clear English, her voice shaking but determined, "may I speak for some of us?" The room fell completely silent. Every woman present understood what was about to happen. This was the moment when paradise would either become possibility or remain forever an impossible dream. Permission granted, Harumi. Harumi looked around at Michiko, Emiko, and Ayako, at the other women whose eyes reflected the same desperate hope. She took a deep breath and spoke words that would change all of their lives forever. "Lieutenant Callahan, some of us wish to request something very unusual. Some of us do not wish to return to Japan. We wish to stay in America." The words hung in the air like something fragile and unprecedented. Lieutenant Callahan's eyes widened in genuine shock. In all her military experience, she had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom and repatriation. She looked around the room, trying to gauge how many women supported this extraordinary request. Slowly, 11 more women stood up alongside Harumi. 12 out of 37 total prisoners, nearly 1/3 of the entire group. Michiko stood next, her medical training giving her a calm demeanor even as her hands trembled. "Lieutenant, we understand this is an unusual request, but Japan we knew does not exist anymore. Families are gone, cities are destroyed, and we have found something here we never had before." She struggled to find the English words, then simply said, "We found kindness." Ayako was crying as she stood, the youngest of the group at 19, facing an impossible choice between duty to a country that was dying and hope for a future that seemed impossible. "My family writes that there is no food, no safety. They tell me not to come home because there is nothing to come home to. Here I have learned to help in kitchen. I can work. I can be useful." The women who remained seated looked at their standing companions with a mixture of understanding and judgment. Some felt that staying would be a betrayal of everything they had suffered for, that returning to Japan was their duty regardless of the hardships awaiting them. Others simply could not imagine abandoning their homeland, even in defeat. The division was painful, cutting through friendships that had formed during their months together. Lieutenant Callahan requested a recess to contact her superiors. The response from Washington took 3 agonizing days to arrive, during which the camp existed in a state of suspended reality. The women who wanted to stay continued their work assignments with fierce dedication, as if their contributions might influence the decision. The women who planned to return tried to maintain dignity while processing their own complex feelings about their companion's choice. Father Bernard Kowalski arrived on the 4th day, a Polish-American chaplain who had been asked to counsel the women through this unprecedented situation. He spoke with each woman individually, in English and through Harumi's translation, asking them to examine their hearts and their motivations. Were they running away from responsibility or running toward redemption? Were they abandoning their country or choosing to become bridges between 2 nations? The War Department's response finally arrived on May 25th. It was characteristically bureaucratic but surprisingly flexible. The women could not remain as prisoners of war, as the Geneva Convention required repatriation. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the chaos in occupied Japan, those who wished to stay could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. They would need sponsors, employment, and approval from local communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The announcement meant that the 12 women would no longer be guaranteed the safety and provision of the camp. They would be stepping into uncertainty, dependent on the goodwill of Americans who had no obligation to help them. It was in many ways a more daunting prospect than simply returning to Japan. But for Harumi and the others, it represented something precious beyond measure. It represented choice. 25 years later, on a bright morning in 1970, Harumi Nakamura Whitmore stood in her kitchen in Sacramento, California, preparing breakfast for her 2 teenage children. The ritual was the same one she had learned in that prison camp so many years ago. Eggs and ham, cooked with care, served with love. Her daughter Susan sat at the table doing homework, while her son David read the morning newspaper. They were American children who barely remembered that their mother had once been an enemy prisoner of war. The integration had not been easy. The Whitmore family had sponsored Harumi as they promised, providing housing and helping her find work as a translator for the State Department. She had faced suspicion and occasional hostility from communities that could not forget Pearl Harbor, that could not see past her Japanese face to recognize her American heart. But she had persevered, building a life one day at a time, one act of kindness received and returned. She had married Thomas Whitmore, the younger son of the family who had sponsored her. Their courtship had been gentle and unexpected, growing from friendship into love over years of shared work in community reconciliation efforts. When they married in 1952, some people refused to attend. Others came and celebrated, seeing in their union a symbol of how former enemies could become family. Michiko had completed her medical degree and become Dr. Michiko Fujiwara, one of the first Japanese-American women to practice medicine in California. She never married, dedicating her life instead to serving underserved communities, as if every patient she healed was a small act of atonement for the war. She and Harumi remained close friends, meeting monthly for breakfast at a small diner where they still ordered eggs and ham, laughing about how far they had come from that prison camp dining hall. Emiko had returned to Japan in 1965 as part of a cultural exchange program, finally making peace with the homeland she had once chosen to leave. She discovered that her family had survived after all, living in a rebuilt Tokyo that bore little resemblance to the city of her youth. The reunion was complicated, filled with tears and difficult questions, but ultimately healing. She divided her time between both countries now, serving as a bridge between American and Japanese business interests. Young Ayako had found her calling in education, becoming a teacher who specialized in helping immigrant children adapt to American schools. She understood what it meant to feel caught between 2 worlds, to struggle with language and identity. Her students loved her fierce dedication and gentle encouragement. She had married a fellow teacher, and they had built a life centered on helping others find their place in America. The morning Harumi stood in her kitchen, she received a phone call that would bring everything full circle. Lieutenant Dorothy Callahan, now retired Colonel Callahan, was organizing a reunion of the women from the camp and the soldiers who had served there. It would be held at the site of the old facility, which had been converted into a community center after the war ended.